So if you're like me, you've been watching news from Western and North Carolina and Eastern Tennessee for the last couple of weeks, disaster, response, recovery, etc. And so I wanted to talk to somebody who has a lot of experience in the area of preparing for these things. We'll talk about recovery later, but in order to prepare for these things, you got to have an understanding of intelligence, what it is you're actually going to need. The best person to talk to this about might be S2 Underground. Welcome back to another T-Rex Talk. I'd like to say that the person that we're talking to is a good friend of mine, but we actually are not friends. He's a very mysterious figure. I'm a fan, but you, sir, have concealed your identity, and I feel a little underdressed for this particular interview. But I'm very pleased to be talking to S2 Underground, the fantastic informational YouTube channel. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and for all of the work that you have done that has really been. I don't know if it goes as far as say instrumental, hugely helpful to me personally, other T-Rex guys, and we've tried to get into stuff beyond firearms.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me. I really do appreciate it.
It's been fascinating watching your channel and T-Rex Labs. Particularly, I was a big sort of debt of gratitude to you testing the waters on stuff, experimenting with things, developing the audience, getting people on board with ideas. So what we're talking about in this episode, what I'd love to pick your brain about, is disaster preparedness. Because you have videos talking about maps, talking about radios, talking about stuff that are near and dear to my heart, but always with this thread connecting them. It's more than just a hobby. This thread of preparedness tools running through all of those things.
Yeah, so it's definitely a renaissance is occurring within the preparedness community, I think. And when I started this whole project a few years ago, and it was really just on kind of a whim, it's really just me and trying to do the best I can to bring some of the things that I've learned in my military services and professional intelligence analyst. Got out of that line of work and have been doing this kind of ever since. So trying to kind of tweak and bring some of the more professionally derived doctrine to the world of preparedness and readiness in general, and really just doing like you say, trying to be more of a serious citizen, take this concept of citizenship to be a little bit more deliberate, I suppose.
Yeah, well, the topic is kind of topical. Obviously, Hurricane Helene has just hit. The next hurricane, I believe, is making landfall on right about the time that we are speaking. And there's not great information coming out, even though it's been days and days coming out of North Carolina. There still is a lot of confusion. So I don't want to do like a post-mortem or anything. If you have any specifics from that event, I think it would be great to touch on those. But one of the obvious lessons that we can see from Helene specifically is that you really need to be ready to be on your own. Arguments can and will be made forever, like how much of your best interest the United States government has at heart, and with whether or not the government actually has a heart. But even if FEMA is doing its level best, as we are being told, that apparently isn't very much. It's obvious that the best time to prepare for an emergency is considerably in advance and not after the wind dies down. So what are some of the things that you would like people to be prepared for, or to be ready for, to be thinking about? Because there's infrastructure issues, there's just all kinds of stuff that we can learn from specific events in North Carolina and East Tennessee. But just in general, I think the big lesson that everybody can see is I'm going to be a lot more on my own than I would like to be if something of this magnitude goes down.
Yeah. One of just to kind of get things rolling, one of the harder lessons learned that's a very, very wave top, very, very high level lesson that's being learned right now, it's a very nuanced concept, is scale. the sheer scale of many different disasters. A lot of times we tend to think of emergency preparedness, prepping in general over the years as more of a localized thing that's going to only affect a certain area, and it's only going to affect that certain area for a short period of time. Now, for many natural disasters, that aren't groundbreaking hurricanes or anything, that's not necessarily a bad idea. However, I think it's led over the years to more of an attitude of, well, let's just stockpile as much as we possibly can and wait for the grid to come back, wait for civilization to kind of come back to a point of normalcy. It's really hard to kind of capture the idea of your power may go out and it might not come back on for 3 or 4 weeks. That's really hard to train for a lot of people. So just understanding the larger scale or mentality with regards to scale when it comes to disaster prepping is really hard to do sometimes, especially since, you can prepare for a one-day event, but, like I said, it may be weeks down the line that you start to figure out some of the things you forgot to prepare for, and it's hard to train for that sort of thing.
Yeah, and when things happen at scale, there are weird knock-on effects. So you have, we had a pretty major flood where we live about 10 years ago, and we discovered roughly how much backup fuel the backup generators for each cell tower had, because they had, some of them had close to 24 hours worth of fuel, some had close to 48 hours of fuel, but we were without power for almost 10 days. So we were without cell phone within a day or two, and we were without cell phone until the power came back on. There are certain water pumping facilities that we had water for several days, and then we didn't have water for many days after power came back on. And when you have a wide area, kind of like what's happening in North Carolina now, you have stores and ATMs stores that have reopened. You have ATMs that probably have cash in them, but there's no way to actually use your card in these places because the data networks are down. So there are a bunch of really interesting, unexpected things that pop up. And that's where, seeing a large-scale disaster that stresses these systems is really fascinating, because it's oftentimes stuff you didn't think about before. But then there's some obvious stuff, like when there is flooding, it's really hard to find pure water. All your pure water sources are all disrupted all the way up into the hills.
Yeah, absolutely. One even more basic than some of the stuff you might think about is just physical fitness. To be honest, prepping starts, as far as I'm concerned, prepping starts with being as physically fit as you can be. Not everyone's going to be a PT stud or anything like that for the most part, but I've never gotten into a situation where I wished I was less fit than I am. And it really starts to affect things like health down the line. A person who is in the best shape of their life, if they go 2 days without water, they're going to be able to perform better than someone who's in really bad shape, who might, have some really serious health problems after less period of time. So it's something that's hard to kind of quantify, and there's really no hard limit to prepare for. But it's one of those things where once you're in flood waters, you're going to find out how strong you really are. That's for sure. Yeah. So it's kind of a hard thing to quantify as well. So especially in the long term.
Yeah. Now, I think that a really good thing to do on that note, there are, obviously there's physical fitness. There are people that have certain medical constraints. Like I know folks that have diabetes or various other types of medications that they need to have for longer periods of time. And they've thought about these things very carefully as they have considered the ramifications of stuff. I have a friend, I need to get him on the podcast at some point, but he is a professor of mass casualty stuff. He's a toxicologist, but he specifically looks at large scale disaster management things. And so he has given a lot of thought to this, like, short-term insulin storage, long-term insulin storage, and then insulin production. Like, what are the best ways to make it on a small scale? Because the best ways to make it are on massive, huge scale. But if you're thinking about long-term isolated, situations, then you don't worry about the most efficient way to make it. You just worry about how you can actually get it made. So focusing on health, there's the physical fitness aspect, and then are there any things that you require specifically or especially, or even neighbors. I think
Yeah.
that's another thing.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's kind of
The
I've heard
whole
very few people talk about this.
Well, I think it's because of the previous sort of pre-2020s era of prepping, hopping on the old school internet forums and trying to find out what are the best ways to prep. I'm sure we've all done that, right? I think that there was this sort of maybe Hollywood-induced idea that a disaster of some kind is going to occur, no matter how big or how small, and we're just going to go Mad Max. It's all, free for all, what I can get from me. Mm-hmm. And in a protracted situation, even you could even say it's probably geography based or population based, population density based, but for the most part, we're still, no matter how bad a disaster is, there's still going to be an element of civilization existing and coming together to kind of help each other. And it kind of gets left out a lot because we don't necessarily want to get into the mentality of prepping ourselves for everyone else. But there's definitely an element to that for sure, especially like you mentioned with people that have existing medical concerns that may come up later, like the insulin example you gave. Some people may prepare, they may go get, say, from their doctor 30 days worth of medications that they're on or whatever. That's fantastic. That's a good thing to do. But what about when that 30 days elapses? Now you're going to start getting back into the rescue phase of an operation when you should be in recovery because someone has finally expended their supply of stuff. So very, very, very complex idea for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been interesting to see the prepper, the stereotypical prepper kind of evolve over the years. So I was talking to a friend recently, yesterday actually, about Red Dawn. Red Dawn has some very unrealistic Hollywood elements, and then it has some pretty brutally realistic other elements to it. Tremors is a great film because it's got some preppers that are portrayed positively, and all their paranoid fantasies involving guns and cannon fuse and large stocks of explosives turned out to be a brilliant plan.
That's awesome.
But I remember the preppers of those days, they didn't have a particularly good threat model. And so there was a lot of things like, I will have a bunker, I will have a year's worth of food. And when I come out of the bunker after a year, people will have fixed stuff for me. And it's like, well, that's not a very reasonable assumption based on the fact that nobody else is prepared for anything except you. And you think people will have fixed stuff, while you're in your bunker. It seems like now, post 2020, I would say especially, people are realizing that there has to be a community aspect to this. And speaking very candidly, like my goal is not to survive. Like survival is preferable to non-survival. My goal is to be able to build something for my children and my grandchildren, not just to like ride out some kind of Mad Max fantasy until the credits roll.
Right. Yeah, that's fantastic. It is really good to see the evolution of the prepping kind of mentality. And like you mentioned, how it really does come back to community. This is kind of a topic that I've struggled with myself for a while, trying to figure out how to convey, just due to the craziness of the past couple of years. Community is what I think all of us should strive for, really. It's just not an option for a lot of people, just due to where they're located or maybe political concerns or something like that. But generally speaking, communities coming together are really going to take care of the things that you forgot about, because we're all, have some sort of deficiencies in some way. We might get sick, we might get injured. Thankfully, the prepper mentality is kind of acknowledging the fact that you're more likely to get really, really sick from drinking bad water than, getting shot or something. It's far more likely to be something mundane that like a community can help you with.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's, I think that is a really helpful practical concern. The other thing that I have mixed feelings about, I'm glad that it's becoming more universally acknowledged, but what's being universally acknowledged is kind of this horrific revelation that the government has some amazing people in it. Like the government has special forces operators that are the tip of the spear. They're excellent at what they do. They're the best equipped. But other parts of the federal government are not known for extreme competence. And so you will end up with this idea that, at the end of the movie, right before the credits roll, somebody's going to come and rescue you. Like the helicopters will arrive and they'll take you to a base where everything is run properly. And the future of humanity is going to be interesting for a while, but it is secure now. I don't think many people expect the United States government to be the savior in very many scenarios at this point. So that is a fascinating, it's a fascinating sort of evolution. Now, obviously, there are people who are true believers in the United States government saving us from everything, absolutely everything. But folks who are thinking about the future in a more clear-eyed way, I think have the benefit of seeing past a lot of those things.
Yeah, it tends to bog down a lot of good work sometimes, because I think the eternal debate that has gone on since the dawn of time and will continue until the end of days is, was this response inadequate due to incompetence or malice? What is it? Which one is it? And I think people try to focus on one or two of those. It could be both in some cases, could be neither in some cases. But by focusing on that, it's not really a solution-driven idea, because you're still kind of stuck without water and power in either case. So the solution for most people doesn't really change too much. But it's definitely something that a lot of people are thinking about. They may not be talking about it, but they're definitely thinking about it for sure.
Yeah. So let's get into some nitty-gritty for a second. So we've mentioned the importance of being physically fit and capable of dealing with bad situations. Either your shelter's gone and you have to deal with cold, you have to move to a new area, you have to get uphill rapidly, something where your own physical characteristics are going to come into play. We've talked a little bit about medical supplies, talked a little bit about water. What is your water recommendation? It's going to be different based on different regions, obviously, but what are some of the things that you would like people to know about water?
Water is an interesting idea. If we're speaking of it in terms of the context of Hurricane Helene, really, I think a larger idea that probably should be considered first is, what are we preparing for? And one of the ways you can arrive at that is risk mitigation. In my opinion, prepping is really just a couple of things: risk mitigation and keeping your options open for later, so that you have options later when other people might not. So when it comes to specific water concerns, there's a lot of easy stuff that you can do. You can go to the FEMA websites. As much as people might not like to do it, they've got some really good tools for determining whether or not you're in a floodplain. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to risk mitigation, you also have to understand what you don't know. So you may only have 80% of the situation, and that 20% of the situation gets left out. For instance, a lot of the reason why this last one is causing so many problems is that a lot of people weren't living in floodplains. They're in the mountains, so very, very high elevation, and very bad things happen, right? So you can plan all you want, but it really comes down to things like terrain analysis. In the military, it's called intelligence preparation of the battle space. In a more citizen-based centric language, you can call it an area study if you wish, but it's kind of very similar in terms of doctrine to intelligence preparation of the battle space, which is just knowing your terrain and knowing what your local risks are for things like that. So water doesn't just show up from nowhere. It's going to come from somewhere. So if you're in a floodplain, that's an easy one. You know that you're in a flood zone. But also, if you're in terrain that is indicative of a flood zone rapidly appearing one day, then that might be a concern as well, even if the websites might not tell you so. So.
Yeah, and we had a significant, this was just a couple years ago now. It was a relatively small event and should have not been a big deal. But unbeknownst to most people, the last few heavy rainfalls had built up a pretty significant natural dam against an old unused railroad bridge. And this dam started to collect water, and we had a particularly heavy rainstorm, and so we ended up with a totally unexpected volume of water suddenly wiping out a really, really small town. And So things like that are really hard to prepare for. No one had thought about this bridge. The railroad isn't maintaining it or keeping an eye on this bridge. It's sort of way out in the middle of nowhere. And so things like that can sneak up on you for sure. But the area that's been impacted by Hurricane Helene has had significant flooding in 1916. So another thing is to know your history, because a lot of times, there are these interesting hydrodynamic events they're rare, but they're not unique. So another great example of needing to know what happened in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. Just knowing the history is half the battle a lot of times. Another thing too is just knowing the area, and it doesn't have to necessarily be deliberate. You don't have to get out your map and sketch things so much. I mean, even just hiking around the area, you start to develop instincts of your local environment. People live in places, right? And they know their local area more than anyone else possibly could. And if you're hiking one day and you're, looking down and into the valley and you say, I don't know who built that building there, but I would not have built it there. Maybe that's something to consider, just because you can start to develop a lot of instincts when you're trying to just live your life normally.
Yeah. So what about drinking water? What about when the water comes? So one of the interesting things, we live in a pretty small town in rural Tennessee. When we had the big flood in 2010, our city water system is not amazing. It leaks a lot, but it's okay because water's cheap. But the problem is, in normal circumstances, your fresh water leaks out, and that's okay. You just pay for it. It's cheaper than fixing the pipes. You can never find any leaks. It's fine. Then in a massive flood, dirty water leaks in, and that becomes an issue. So there's a bunch of different considerations when it comes to fresh water, even in a place that has, there was still plenty of water in the water towers for the first few days. So gravity feed water was working fine coming out of everybody's faucets, even for days after the power went out. But knowing what water you can't trust is pretty important.
Yeah, especially considering that a lot of the solutions for water treatment on the market today are mostly geared towards hikers or backpackers or the outdoor community in general, which might not have to filter gasoline out of their water or chemicals or antibiotics or something. So the water, when it comes to a flood or anything like that, is going to be some of the hardest to treat on Earth, because it's going to be usually very turbid. It's not going to be very easy for things like UV lights or chemical treatments a lot of times. So, getting down into the weeds, you may have to filter and chemically treat and throw a UV light on it like a Steripin or something, just to make sure everything's good. Because again, like you mentioned earlier, things compound. And the last time you want to get something like Giardia or crypto or something is during a disaster, dehydrating yourself more. Now you're very sick. Now things start to snowball and we've got a problem. So it's very much a holistic approach of having some on hand, having some that you can treat on hand, and then having some way to get it later. That's very hard to have all three, but some people might. So it's very hard.
Do you have any particular go-tos or specific recommendations? I have drunk a lot of water out of Sawyer bottles. I've used a Steripin in a lot of different water bottles, so I do like those things, but never in a situation where I'm having to treat water that is full of antifreeze and other stuff.
Yeah. Really, I do like you mentioned, I prefer the Sawyer filters. There are some made by MSR. I think it's called the Guardian. It's like a $400 water filter, but it'll filter out everything. The mentality that I try to have is how easy is it to get new filters? Because if you're trying to provide water for a community, not just for yourself, not just while backpacking for a couple of days, you're trying to process large amounts of water for cooking and hygiene and things like that too. it's going to be kind of hard to do. So I like the Sawyer filters because they have a million gallons. You'll probably never get to that. I've broken every Sawyer filter that I've got, clogged it up with sediment or something before we get to that million, but they work really well. I like to, for the area where I'm in, we've got a lot of red clay, which has got a lot of mica in it, a lot of silica in it. It is very, very bad for water. So whenever it rains here, it's just mud. So what I use is I use I think it's called a millibank bag or a millbank bag, just a canvas bag you can hang up to filter sediment out. It's kind of a holistic approach. So pre-filter, filter. If you need to during a disaster, I always try to chemically treat water. The things that are becoming a little bit more popular now are those. I think they're made by Potable Aqua. I'm not quite sure on that, but they're little chlorine generators, so you don't have to stockpile pills. Those are pretty handy as well in the long term. They just use salt and a small water source, and you can generate chlorine to treat water forever, basically.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I hear really good things about those. And they use such a small amount of electricity to convert the sodium chloride into whatever chlorine is low enough that some of them are tiny and they have a little solar panel on the back and you can keep them charged easily. I've been meaning to tinker with those because, the chlorine tabs always run out and the iodine tabs always taste weird. And so I think it's a fascinating thing that I need to get some more time on. What about food? Water's an immediate concern, but you can't go too long without food. So what are some of your things that you want people to think about in a long-term sustainment type scenario?
Sure. I think probably one of the better bits of advice that I've heard myself over the years is don't prep anything. Don't stockpile any food you don't eat yourself. So for most people who are, struggling right now, it's not going to be very popular to go out and say, hey, go spend $1,000 on, whatever, bucket of food that you can find online, like freeze-dried stuff. It's really easier just to say, hey, go next time you buy a can of beans at the grocery store, buy 2. That's really easy to do. And over time, it adds up. And you can start rotating through it a lot easier because you're not having to sit there with the mental debate of, should I crack open that Mountain House meal or not? It cost me $8. Can I keep it for another year before it goes bad? You're just going to eat your own food for a while. Most people can probably stock up at least a few months of food in their own kitchen pantry, no sweat. And then those other types of foods can take over. So if you're planning on being fairly active during a crisis, you might need those backpacking meals that cost a little bit more. You might need some of those MREs that you can get that are a little easier to consume on the go. But it's definitely not one of those things where you can just go out and buy one thing and you're set. It's really more along the lines of a multi-layered approach. Really, mostly just so that you don't waste and so that you don't get sick. Again, remaining not medically compromised during a disaster just makes your life so much easier. I have been sick during disasters before, and it is not fun. So if you're trying out a new food, it might be best to try it out before the disaster strikes.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things at this very moment, I have a friend, and I don't know that he wants to be identified. So I'll sort of talk around this a little bit. But he has done a thing that was very cool on its own, but it has been a super benefit during disasters. So he runs a food bank. And the food bank kind of has 3 levels. There's stuff that he sells that is not, it's not a bargain. It is organic stuff, and you're getting maybe cheaper than at the store, but you're not getting a bargain on it. Then the other category of stuff he has is stuff that, for whatever reason, because the FDA is a complicated place and how retail food works is really, really, really convoluted. He will have stuff that can't be sold in stores anymore, but it hasn't expired. And that stuff is usually a really good deal. But then he is prepared. He has trucks that move stuff around. He has communities that he delivers to in multiple places. And then he has food that isn't allowed to be sold that he has access to and can give away. And oftentimes during disasters, people give away a lot more food from these larger sources that he's cultivated. So his normal activities, when there is no disaster, keeps his trucks on the road, keeps him connected to food suppliers, and keeps him connected to little communities. So where we are, actually, one of the food pickups is or food drop-offs rather, is in the T-Rex parking lot. So if something were to happen here, he would already know 24 people. He would already know parking lots where he can gather and do stuff. He would already know all this stuff. He'd already have trucks that can go places. He'd already have different sources where he can pick stuff up. And he is currently in North Carolina doing stuff with groups of people that he has already built relationships with. So guys who have figured out how to build stuff that works in a disaster and then also works the rest of the time is really kind of the key, because there's no way to pull that type of logistical stuff together in an emergency as well as if you've already built it and you already have the contact list and you have a group of people who already see each other at the monthly food drop-off anyway and already know where each other's houses are, because occasionally I'm out of town, so somebody picks up my food drop-off and brings it to my house, that kind of thing. So he has built little community groups around this food network that are a blessing to the families that are there. They get deals on stuff, they get healthy food, they can stock up and already have bulk food. But then in an emergency, he has a whole bunch of resources that he can bring into play. So it's a pretty fascinating way to think about stuff. T-Rex Arms thinks about this a little bit. T-Rex Arms is a company that works well when times are good. And then in a really bad situation, one of my favorite things about T-Rex is we have a warehouse full of stuff in an emergency that would be really handy to have nearby. So it's an extra layer or an extra wrinkle of things to think about as you're doing an entrepreneurial thing or building out a business or so forth. But I'm really grateful for that guy and the stuff that he's done and how well prepared he was for this because of his, regular activities.
If we want to use a more professional doctrinal term, this reminds me of the term dual use, meaning that a thing or an item or an idea has two uses. You can use it during a peacetime, everything's fine situation, but during a more contingent situation where things are not entirely certain, you can rapidly switch over. Like you mentioned, that is very, very hard to do unless you've built your business like that from the ground up or heavily modified. Now, it's not entirely the most efficient at some times during a normal everyday operation, but it more than makes up for it because, going back to, say, the doctrine and military history in general, from Alexander the Great to Napoleon, logistics is what wins military conflicts. And in that idea, we can definitely take that idea from the military history world and impose it on, say, normal disaster response too. Logistics is definitely the hardest thing to do for anyone, really. So if you can pre-stage a lot of that, if you can get these relationships built, get your communications plans built, prepare ahead of time, just have some kind of plan for how things are going to go, that can be a very, very, very powerful tool for sure.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the planning. I agree with you that people should be prepared with stuff on their own. Let's talk about the community side a little bit, because communications is something that you talk a lot about. You've built the Ghost Net is a whole bunch of people that get together and discuss things on HF. What are some of the ways that you can prepare people to be better organized ahead of time in your community with communication?
Well, one of the first things, while Hurricane Helene is still fresh in everyone's mind and Hurricane Milton is still in people's mind as well, one of the things that you can do right now, which I'm doing myself, is you're going to see a lot of things on social media. And one thing that you might see quite a lot is a charity or a group or a church or something, which has a list of things that they need, things that they either ran out of or they didn't prepare for ahead of time. Screenshot that and remember that for later, because that is a pre-made list of things during a disaster in your community that your locals didn't have. And it makes it easier for you to donate these supplies later or even before the disaster. So that's very easy. On the communications front, a more general idea is just to have some kind of plan. One thing that I like to kind of ask people is, if you're sitting at work and you normally get like a text at lunch every day from your spouse or something like that, and you realize you haven't gotten it in a few hours, what are you going to do? What's your plan? If your cell phone suddenly doesn't work and you don't have internet access, it may not be the end of the world, but it may be the end of the world in your area. It may be the end of connectivity. So just having a lost contact plan, what should I do just in case we lose some sort of cellular connection, that's very helpful to have. And you can't really develop this stuff after disaster. You have to have the plan ahead of time, because it's kind of like an oxymoronic idea. You're trying to communicate with people who don't know how you're trying to communicate with them. So you have to communicate the plan, but if there are no communications, you have to do that beforehand. So just having some kind of plan ahead of time is very, very helpful, especially when it comes to communities.
One of the fun things that has worked really well in this disaster, it was one of the fun things to see in the disaster, is stuff that works well, stuff that gets vindicated in a way. And I think it's Starlink. The fact that they were able to bring a bunch of Starlink units in, they're able to set up a geofenced area. All the Starlink units inside this area just work without setup. Like, these are all really good demonstrations of the system. So one of the things that we've talked about as a church is, like, we should have a Starlink unit that everybody knows, like, this is going to be at the church and it's going to have this many days of battery backup, and people who need internet can come to the church and get on the internet that way. T-Rex has Starlink internet backup, but we also need to set up a GMRS repeater. What everybody wants on the T-Rex Labs channel and the T-Rex Arms channel, what everybody wants is some sort of magical, cheap MPU-5 digital mesh radio network that is electronic warfare hardened and has really good encryption and talks to ATAC and all that stuff. But in a disaster, you kind of want a different radio. You don't want something that is incredibly locked down with crypto to talk to other people. So we've been categorizing radios in buckets. We have our public radios, which are to talk to the public, talk to as many people as possible. We have our private radios, which are our T-Rex business band radios, which are encrypted. And then secret radios is the category that most people kind of think that they want, which is low probability of intercept, low probability of detection stuff. I think those are three good mental buckets to put things in. What would you use for a public radio? Something that would let you get to as many people as possible?
So one of the things that I try to start with when it comes to radios is, because it's such a gear heavy field, right? People want to know what radio to buy. What I generally start off with is instead of thinking about it like that, let's match capabilities to the gear. So let's figure out what we want to do first, and then we'll figure out what gear matches that list. So for most people, in most disasters of the scale that are kind of going on right now in North Carolina and Florida, your simple, basic, cheap analog handheld radios are working. Now, are they okay for everything? No, I would not use this if I was in a trench in eastern Ukraine right now. But when it comes to getting as many people on the same page as possible, tools like this definitely have a use. Things like Meshtastic are, again, something that's kind of contentious among the radio world at times, but kind of getting away from the amateur side of things is also not entirely a bad idea sometimes. Like you mentioned, encryption is one of those things that really only a business band license can get you. And I think that, like you mentioned, is super, super important for some things. I mean, we don't want to be, just to give a very specific example, we don't want to be hopping on a standard unencrypted analog radio and talking about a fatality that we just discovered and who it might be. This is medical PII. Not only is it, I don't even know if it's legal or not to transmit that kind of information, but it's the things you have to think about. It's not necessarily in terms of something that's super tactical. So really matching capabilities to a radio is probably for the best. You can't go wrong in either way with any kind of cheap analog radio. In terms of equipping the masses really quickly, they're easy to pre-stage ahead of time. So if that's what you're looking for, that's probably a very good way of thinking about things.
Yeah. And I'm going to probably ruffle some feathers here, but there are a lot of those cheap Chinese radios that are programmed with FRS frequencies, but sometimes they're programmed with other frequencies. And there's a lot of rules related to what you can and cannot do on the different ham bands. And I would say that there's times to take those rules seriously. And then in emergencies, the FCC has made it very clear that you can transmit on the ham bands. It has to be a significant emergency, but I would define significant emergency pretty broadly. And I would say this is a perfect opportunity for people to use the ham bands to let people know what's going on in an emergency. Other hams can participate in coordinating, forwarding information, et cetera. So there's some people who are going to, have things to say about that, but I believe that we should be a lot more flexible and forgiving of some of those regulations. And there's always going to be time for the FCC to come along and talk about stuff later on. That's great.
Certainly. Yeah, it's been kind of a contentious topic over the past few days as people kind of come to a lot of conclusions. But, you're right. There is a time and place for everything. And maybe it's time to kind of re-examine what our definitions are. Why are the regulations in place? Mm-hmm. Re-examining these sorts of things with a clear eye, a fresh eye, and trying to figure out, is what we're doing really working, or is it not? Because, that's the only way that we can learn, right, is to figure out what doesn't work and what does. And if something doesn't work or is causing, unnecessary problems, then, maybe take a look at that and we'll see what we can do to fix that. But yeah, radios are always going to be a kind of a contentious topic for that reason. So,
yeah. One of the strengths of the ham radio community is that it is a very diverse group of people. Now, it's mostly crusty old white guys, but in other ways, it is extremely diverse. It's guys who got into this hobby because they like electronics. It's guys that got into this hobby because they want to talk to people. It's guys who got into this hobby because they were like a kind of a niche, hipstery hobby to be better at than other people with. So you will run into all these people as you do stuff in these bands. And like I said, that is one of the strengths of the hobby. But it is something that can become a weakness at other times and in other places, and you just have to kind of like be ready for that. So I think this is a perfect example, though, where you have a disaster that is significant, and it is unexpected and kind of unprecedented, not entirely, because 1916 happened, but it feels unprecedented in its scope and its location. And so there's a bunch of people that didn't have a widespread communication plan, but a lot of them have blister pack radios and a lot of them have Baofangs, and it's the perfect time to listen around for UHF, VHF, FM frequencies, and find people to talk to kind of ad hoc. And so I'm really glad that there's folks that have those things, that have those Baofangs, and are able to do that. And so as much as I love the idea of secret radios that are LPD, LPI, highly encrypted, there's also times when I want zero of those features. I would just like to have the basics. Oh yeah, 5 watts of the basics, please.
Oh yeah, exactly. Most of the time for my own stuff, I'm using digital, but in a disaster, there are downsides. Just having the ability to talk to as many people as possible is definitely a thing. I think one of the larger ideas that kind of gets forgotten is, like you mentioned earlier, there are a bunch of different communities that are all they're speaking the same language, but they're not really on the same sheet of music with regards to how they view things. So you've got the hams, you've got the business band stuff, commercial radio, you've got GMRS becoming a huge thing, which is kind of in both worlds because, like you mentioned, a lot of those radios can really technically do both. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff. And then, of course, there's like the whole maker crafting community that is developing open source stuff like Meshtastic and other mesh sort of communications platforms that use your smartphone and just a small little radio. So having a well-rounded solution to things is your solution for a disaster like we're kind of living through now and the ones that we're going to live through in the future is not necessarily in one of these camps. It's spread out amongst all of these different communities. Yeah. So you've kind of got to go to a lot of different places to find that expertise.
Yeah, I just got back from vacation, and one of the things that I did usually when I'm on vacation, I tinker with stuff. So I took along a bunch of Meshtastic stuff, and it was interesting to just leave a node running as we drove up and down, and just see how many other Meshtastic nodes and repeaters I picked up. And it was about half a dozen repeaters that are already out there that we admittedly only really saw these in bigger cities, but it made me want to set up a Centerville Meshtastic repeater for anybody that finds themselves, the odds of this are low, but it doesn't mean they can't. Finds themselves in an emergency situation and they have a Meshtastic device in their pocket or bag. There's enough people out there that it probably has happened before. And setting up a repeater for that, setting up a GMRS repeater here at the shop where we have some infrastructure. These are some things that we can do, which are not, as you mentioned before, super efficient. It is not efficient for T-Rex to have a business band license and then also have a GMRS repeater on our tower and a battery backup for it. But it is a community service type thing that we could do. And there's a bunch of extra weight that you can carry for other people. And it's not brutally utilitarian efficiency. It is something else. The benefit is something else when you carry weight for other people, and benefit your community.
Absolutely. And working these problems out now and finding the solutions out now is really great. Like, for instance, just with your Meshtastic example, there aren't a whole lot of people in the United States using it to where they're within line of sight to each other. But our friends across the pond in the United Kingdom, throughout London, it's just a absolutely massive mesh. So big, in fact, that they have, over the past few weeks and months, worked out the kinks of how the problems that may arise from having such a large network. So they're working through this. They're figuring these things out now, which benefits us here in the States as well. So, things are being done. Things are definitely working, and I do appreciate everyone being involved in not just radio stuff but other stuff as well, who are trying to make a difference. Trying to do the best they can, as best they can do it.
Yeah. I was talking to Josh over at Ham Radio Crash Course, and he mentioned that he's tried to build some bigger meshes and run into issues, changed modes, had better performance, and there was a very large mesh that got built at this year's DEF CON conference that was pretty functional. So I need to look up what's going on in London, because this is one of the things, Meshtastic is not the super secret squirrel tactical radio that you want, but it is a fantastic thing for, long-term community emergency networking with a little bit of latency to it, if we can get it working. And that sounds really nifty.
Yeah, perspective is definitely everything. I personally am a huge fan of things and ideas that punch above their weight, that do a lot more than is expected of them for either their price point or the difficulty or the barriers that they might present. Meshtastic is comparatively cheap. It's in many different ways it can augment an analog radio like this one very well. Is it the perfect tool for every task? No. I mean, it's sort of like, using a Leatherman when a regular wrench will do. You're going to have to make some compromises in some way, but I really do appreciate the efforts that people are taking to do things that are a little bit more effective than they should be.
Have you messed around with APRS at all as a messaging platform?
I have. I've had mixed results. APRS is great because it's similar in idea to Meshtastic, but not really. Meshtastic is kind of a whole other thing. APRS's claim to fame is that, it's an older standard, so it's been around for a while, and because it's been around for a while, there are a lot of nodes and repeaters out there that can function with APRS.
It's starting to be built into more radios.
It's exactly.
The maturity of it is key. Yeah.
Is good. Yeah. I think since I wonder if in the long run, digital modes are going to become a little bit more popular because we see kind of ICOM, for instance, major radio manufacturer starting to implement things like being able to send images over a radio, over a handheld radio even. So that might be something that I don't think APRS is going to be replaced anytime soon, but it definitely can be a good tool if used in the right situations. One of the things that the ham radio community, I think, has kind of a hard time with is repeater networks or larger scale radio projects that aren't really off grid. We really have to kind of define what we want to use here. They can definitely work and have probably saved lives, honestly, but again, matching a capability to a
there's another thing that happens. I'll wait for you.
You still there? Sorry, you cut out for just a second.
So the way that Riverside works is if your connection gets cut, it keeps recording locally.
Oh man, I'm losing you.
We'll edit out the asking if we're still there bits.
Oh no. I wonder if I've lost you.
See this here.
Yeah, I can't hear you anymore. I think you've frozen.
Our Wi-Fi. Let's see.
Let me see here.
My Wi-Fi here.
I think you're back now. Yeah, it should be good now.
Okay.
All right. Awesome.
So the good news is your computer recorded you finishing your thought.
Awesome.
So pick up wherever you stopped talking.
Oh man, I already forgot what I said.
We're talking about APRS and where you stopped for me, you were talking about APRS still having value, but other things coming along after it, and ham radio community having difficulty with big networks. And networks that are connected to the internet, and they're a full-on ham radio solution, but they're not actually emergency communication capable. They're not off-grid. They're not resilient.
Right. So the interesting part about a lot of things in ham radio are that you can really see the brilliance and the utter ingenuity of an engineer back in the 1980s, 1990s, and they thought of a problem and they thought of a solution for it. So that's where almost all of the ham radio solutions come from, a problem being solved. And over time, a lot of those problems, I think sometimes some ham radio projects kind of mission creep away from the original intent of being truly off-grid, because we think of radio as being functional when there is no other infrastructure, and that largely is true. However, there are some projects here and there that really do need connectivity to someone else. One of the big problems, for instance, is just a basic repeater, right? Well, out here in the Western North Carolina, they're finding out that repeaters need power to function. So your emergency ham radio repeater, somebody's got to go out there and sit with that tower with a generator, and it takes time to do. So, you may think that you have an off-grid solution, and it might not entirely be off-grid. So again, these things are kind of hard to plan for. It's really hard to simulate a repeater going down. But generally speaking, it's probably a good idea to kind of, again, try to work these things out before a disaster strikes, because, like we've mentioned, you can't really fix it afterwards, or it's very hard to, at least.
Well, and that's what I love about a PACE plan, where I say, like, I got my phone, and if my phone goes down, I've got APRS text messaging through these repeaters. If those repeaters go down, I've got basic simplex communication with the guys near me, and then inReach. Hopefully inReach doesn't go down. Having multiple layers and multiple options is great. inReach is something, the little Garmin devices that use the Iridium network. That's a device, I think, that punches above its weight. And there's a new one. There's a new version of the messenger that does voice, not real-time voice, but lets you record little voice memos and send those, and send images as well. So what are some other devices? We spent a lot of time on communication. What are some other devices that punch above their weight, that are more bang for their buck, that are good dual-use devices that you would recommend?
Well, just speaking of kind of my own experience, big topic, but one thing that really comes to mind is hand tools. Simply just having hand tools on hand, a hammer, and construction materials too, because one thing that really is probably more of a thought experiment kind of question is, I like to ask people,
well, what are you planning to do for this storm, this disaster, this wildfire, whatever? What are you planning to do? Now, hold that thought. How many other people have that same idea? Because inevitably, hurricanes come and go, natural disasters come and go, but inevitably somebody always goes and buys out all the plywood at, Home Depot or Lowe's. Can't find screws anywhere. So just having literally just hand tools on hand can make your life so much easier in terms of repairing things and just being a little bit more prepared in that regard. Trying to think of something else that might be useful to have. Being able to cook food, honestly, in different contingent situations is very, very helpful to have. Sort of like the water idea. I prefer a more layered defense kind of thing where we've got little backpacking stoves with gas canisters, but, if you're in a real world disaster, REI or Cabela's is not going to be open to sell you those gas canisters. So being able to have a stove or something like that can, I don't know, maybe run off of normal gasoline that you can siphon from a car. These things in the long term really do help in terms of making sure that you've got capabilities later on. Sooner or later, preparedness is going to switch into more of we're going to have to rebuild little tiny parts of civilization if a disaster goes on long enough. Thankfully, it's quite rare. But, preparing for the potential of stockpiling things, then let's start stockpiling things that help us make things and so on and so forth, like you mentioned earlier. Very helpful stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And the amount of times that I've had to use the wrong tool for the job because I wasn't ready, it's not always a disaster, but I remember one of the first car wrecks I worked, the jaws of life wasn't functioning. And so one of the guys was like, all right, well, let me show you how you cut into this car if all you have is a hacksaw with a metal blade on it. And so we did it the old fashioned way. And so it was a great educational experience, but also, boy, is it not fun to cut through hardened steel with a hacksaw when the non-functioning jaws of life are sitting right there. I've spent a lot of time using the wrong tool for the job, sometimes because I didn't know what I was doing or I didn't bring the right thing. And so having tools is a really key one. And having multi-use tools and having an understanding of how tools work. There's a guy that I love working with. I love doing projects with this guy because he has such an out-of-the-box way of thinking about stuff. He is a blacksmith. Actually, there's another guy I need to get on the show. He's a blacksmith. He's an 18th century blacksmith by specialty. Like that is the type of work that he does. And he does high-end, when people are doing reproductions of things for whatever reason, he's the kind of guy that they call. So he knows all these amazing tricks of doing things with metal and with wood from back in the days before they had a lot of the tools that we have today. So he will do fascinating stuff on paper or with string when I'm still fumbling around with a tape measure. And he's like, well, you don't need to actually do all this math. You just need to mark these things on a string and then pull it at different angles. And then, ta-da, no math required. You just do it and then you're done. So there's all kinds of tricks of the trade that people can show you if you work with them enough. And you learn techniques you can apply to other areas. So I love the idea of collecting hand tools. But then make sure that you're doing enough with the hand tools you actually learn, how you could use them, how they actually work and what they're actually for. But then do stuff with people that also have knowledge that can teach you stuff, because that's huge. The tools that you've learned up here are massive.
Absolutely.
Massive help. There's so many things that I learned, dealing with broken Hickman County Rescue Squad equipment. Intensely frustrating at the time, but probably far more educational than if everything had worked perfectly.
Oh yeah, definitely just getting hands-on experience with something. And, sometimes it's really hard to get hands-on experience with the thing that you need experience in. It's, Murphy's Law strikes at the most inopportune times, but knowledge is usually free and it doesn't weigh anything and nobody can take it from you. Once you have learned how to do something, a skill that is learned is very hard to forget. We may forget world events. We may forget what happened last year, but, you put a tool on somebody's hand,
they'll remember how to use it over time, especially if they've gotten a lot of experience with it over the years. But you're right. It definitely does take a concentrated effort to keep these skills up in the short term for sure.
Yeah. I own a lot of weapons that I'm extremely knowledgeable about, but not very proficient in. And I own a lot of radio stuff that I've read a lot of stuff about, and I would struggle to remember how to do stuff with. So that's an embarrassing thing to admit. I've tried hard not to ask you questions that would lead to you accidentally doxing yourself, but are there any non-specific things that you can tell us about? What are some of the most valuable things that you learned, either by doing things properly or doing things improperly, in your interesting careers, that are hard to learn any other way, that you would really recommend that people think about or understand or go do? Like, having radio equipment on the wall is great, on the shelf is great, and then realizing that you don't actually know how to do it is embarrassing. I'm much more confident in people's ability to take a rifle off the shelf that they're not proficient with and use it than take a radio off the shelf that they're not proficient in and accomplish something with it. So can you give us any fun, fun, non-identifiable stories about stuff that you've learned that you would really highly recommend?
Yeah, my career was fairly boring. I worked for about 10 years in the intel world. I did mostly, I was an all-source analyst, which meant I was really good at doing not one thing, but a bunch of different things, or so they told us at least. For the later part of my career, I did mostly targeting in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, but it was a little hard to transfer some of those skills over. However, one of the things that just kind of hit home is how hard it is to convey the expediency needed to do something. Things are always going to take a longer period of time than you planned, and having the ability to get up and go right now and do something, whatever it may be, is very hard to do. Like if there was a car accident right now out in front of your house, are you prepared for that? Are you going to have a first aid kit on hand? Are you going to have your cell phone in your pocket so that you can call authorities? And the list is just endless. Having a more broad view of responding to things is kind of hard to convey sometimes, but yeah, generally that's the one thing that I would say is things are going to take a lot of time. You're probably going to be very tired, very sleep deprived, and things are going to snowball in many cases. So the things are going to be harder later on. So sort of the theme for today is preparedness, right? So preparing ahead of time. Combat stress is a thing that's very hard to simulate in the preparedness community. I mean, it's really hard to train being shot at, to be honest. However, one thing you can easily do is once a month simulate a power outage, just a single day, go without electricity for 24 hours and see what things you missed. Usually that's a pretty safe thing for most people to do, and you can keep those skills going. Like you mentioned, it definitely takes proficiency to be a little bit more deliberate. It's very, very easy to get complacent, and complacency kills. That's why that phrase exists. So just being able to take things in stride is very important. And overall, I know that's kind of the reason why I stress communication so much is anytime that I have seen someone get into a bad situation or even have a situation result in, say, a fatality, unfortunately, it's almost always been to communications. Communications is very hard to do because you've got kind of this Bermuda Triangle of bad things. It's something that's not really instinctive for most people. It's hard to learn and hard to teach, and it's a skill that is very rapidly perishable. So, anytime there's been a crisis situation that I personally have kind of experienced, number one, communications would have been vastly appreciated at the time. So, yeah, it's really hard to kind of pregame a lot of these things and prepare, but that's some of the things that I think about constantly.
Yeah, I think that's huge. Yeah, the things that, and it kind of it kind of conspires against you. Like the things that you need to work on the most are the things that are most unpleasant to work on most of the time. So that is, the perishable skills are usually the things that are less fun to do over and over again. But it requires a level of discipline that's there.
A little bit of extreme ownership too, being able to drive forward no matter what. It's hard to do sometimes. For sure.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate things that you have done with your channel to like crack the door open for people. They still have to do the work, but you have made it a lot easier to get started with a bunch of stuff, map related stuff. The other thing I tested last week was I printed maps on the Write in the Rain paper with a LaserJet printer, and quite a bit more durable than I expected. Like that's a very solid solution to waterproof maps. They still need to be laminated if you want to do the draw on them with the markers and wipe it off. But you have something that you can use in the rain. You have something that can handle being crumpled, and the ink doesn't get washed away. So it's that's another pretty hearty recommendation for me that I think you have already talked about.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I really do appreciate you stressing maps a lot, because maps are such a nightmare. I was quite literally in 2018, 2019, I was printing out maps that I made myself in Afghanistan with a printer that I ordered off of Amazon. So, that's always a problem, even for the most, the most equipped militaries in the world. So it's going to be a hard time for a community which is just trying to, live their life day to day. It's going to be something that is often forgotten. Just having physical maps on hand and the ability to make them as well is very, very important to have, for sure.
Yeah. So it's a very cool thing that going back to the ham radio community, you see these areas and races, organizations that are specifically set up for emergency assistance. And one of the things that almost all those guys have in their little trailer, their generator powered trailer, is a printer, because you're going to have data, you're going to want to give it to people. I now need to do something that is going to be very unpleasant. It's not going to be a super skill building thing, but I need to, this is dumb. We need to figure out which color laser printer we recommend for people. We're going to have to see like how much power it uses, and what is the Glock 19 of color laser printers? It's not a question I was ever planning to ask myself, but that's something that I really want to know now.
Yeah, it's boring stuff that people don't really want to put the time into, but I have also done a lot of research. I mean, I think I'm still using a printer that's been discontinued, so it's something that's really hard to convey, and being able to transport it, like what kind of case do you need so the ink, if you're using an inkjet so that it doesn't run out. Oh, it's just ultimate nerd stuff for sure. For sure.
Yeah. Well, it just kind of highlights the amount of work that needs to get done. But I want to make sure that everybody listening to this podcast knows where to find you. Is your YouTube channel the main hub, or do you have somewhere else that you want people to go?
Yeah, that's probably the best place. You can find pretty much everything there. I've also got a bunch of links in the description of every video that I post. So YouTube's probably the place where it's easiest to find me, but that's pretty much it. Also on Telegram, Twitter, or X now, I guess. Those are the platforms that I'm on for the most part, most of the time. So.
Yeah. Well, keep us posted. You do a great job of weekly updates on stuff that's happening in the world, as well as deep dives into specific communication technology. But I really appreciate your community building efforts. How is the GhostNet doing? Is it a year now? Has it been running for a year now?
I think we're coming up on a year. Yeah, I think it has been. It's had a few iterations here and there. I'm getting ready to release the latest version of it. Hopefully soon. But yeah, it's, for those who probably don't know, it's just an HF radio plan that tries to solve a lot of the problems that can't really be solved with short range, smaller person-to-person radios. Having a more strategic view of things is probably a little bit more helpful. Now, there are, of course, other more professional networks, like you mentioned, Aries and Races and things like that use HF for disaster preparedness, but taking some of the pressure off of the more, how should I say, agency supporting kind of networks is kind of helpful. And really, like I said,
one of the hardest things to do is just have a plan. So it's a stopgap plan. It helps people communicate with each other over thousands of miles. And yeah, it seems to be working pretty well. Looking forward to kind of expanding it and seeing what we can do better with it.
Nice. Yeah. Well, that's the sort of thing that I think is really helpful because I have HF radio is hard to get into for a number of reasons. The radios are much more expensive. They require much more power. The antennas are far more confusing. They're bigger. They're longer. They are more finicky and harder to set up. Like everything about it is worse, except that you can talk farther. And so every time I have messed around with HF in the past, it has pretty much been just to listen, just to see what I find, listen in on it, figure out what the ionosphere is doing. But having a weekly net that people are going to be on, and it's like-minded people that have stuff to say to each other is, I think, a super helpful thing for folks so that they can get those skills in, get the repetitions in. So I thank you for doing that. It's the sort of thing that is pretty dual use. It's a great decentralized way to hang out with like-minded folks. Sure. Not very many words per minute, but still it's like an old school chat room before we knew how to type. It's kind of probably the speed.
Yeah, 1 or 2 sentences a minute is about the most you'll get, but people are using it and they're sharing information. That's the hard part about HF radio is is kind of like the backwoods of the radio world. There's a lot of interesting content on it for sure, but trying to use it a little bit more utilitarian, encourage people to use it, especially since the Starlink dynamic is going to change things when people are looking at, say, a $2,000 HF radio or a $600 Starlink. We've got to justify that HF or see what uses it might have when Starlink doesn't necessarily work sometimes. So again, it's a work in progress, but I'm definitely happy to help coordinate a lot of this together. So,
yeah, well, I appreciate it. And then one of the things that we can talk about offline later, but
sure.
I'll just say it publicly because I've talked about this with a couple people. We need to have a cheaper, simpler HF radio for people who just want to use JS8 call to jump on things like the GhostNet. If it's not going to be, something we're going to build an entire hobby around. It's just going to do 1 or 2 things. It doesn't need to be as expensive. If we're going to use speaker wire antennas and we're going to be using it in pulling it out of a backpack and running it off of just a pretty small battery, it could be a very affordable little device. So somebody needs to build that. And there's a bunch of ham radio guys that have built really functional little tiny, lightweight, backpackable setups. Mm-hmm. Something that is a little more mass producible and a little bit more rugged and a little bit more like appliance level, I think is a super valuable thing. Nobody wants it right now because Starlink is getting cheaper and going everywhere unless you watch Netflix over it. But this is a thing that I think is really, really handy. It'll be too late to make it in the next disaster. So it's on my to-do list, but it's also on my don't know how to-do list. So I keep kicking it out there as something that needs percolating in the industry or the community or the wherever, and maybe it'll just sort of congeal once enough of us have enough conversations. We're like, hey, I know a guy. One super cool thing, it's somewhat unrelated, but the Starlink and SpaceX group is the largest printed circuit board manufacturer in the United States right now. So they have spun up a pretty significant electronics manufacturing capability stateside. So it's a great example of once you start to do a thing, opportunities open up to build out other really useful things. So the fact that Elon Musk, for all of his weirdnesses, the fact that he has teams of guys who are doing commercial space launches, building communications technology, building manufacturing technology, these are huge. The implications of these are huge, even beyond the meme opportunities. I think that's the stuff that he does that gets attention is nothing compared to the implications of some of the smaller stuff that's going on. The fact that he's built the largest printed circuit board manufacturer in the country is it's pretty neat. So don't despise the day of small beginnings or stuff that doesn't look cool and glamorous, because usually it's the the non-cool and glamorous stuff that really matters at the end of the day, or in a disaster situation.
Oh yeah, the demand is there, and we are at a very, very interesting point in history. I think it's almost like there's another industrial revolution in many different ways in terms of people re-examining where they get things from, where they get the parts to make things from, and who owns the communications. How can we, ensure that our own communications are more reliable? But the demand is most certainly there, especially in, say, like the ham radio world. For anyone who's a software engineer who wants to make improvements, most of the ham radio community uses software that's about 30 years old. So, the radios are essentially 1930s technology. So, you can see companies out there developing. You can see usually it's like a very squirrely or sketchy Chinese company that's going to develop something that's very uniquely marketed, I should say. Like you can tell, okay, this company is trying to build this product because someone else is working on it, like a bigger company. So very interesting times indeed.
Yeah.
It's very good stuff indeed.
Yeah. Yeah. And every gray cloud, for example, of FEMA mismanagement or lack of preparedness or these really painful things, there is this silver lining of it is a great lesson that can be learned. So I think that there has been a lot of opportunities for people to come away with significantly better perspectives on things, even in all of the death and destruction and turmoil of these hurricanes. So my recommendation to folks would be don't, there is this famous saying, never waste a tragedy or a catastrophe, never waste the opportunities that come along with that. And that's usually meant in a kind of a malicious way by people that want to seize control and do bad things. But by the same token, never allow these things to actually go to waste. Yeah. There are lessons to be learned here all across the board. Don't miss those opportunities.
Absolutely. There's two sides to every coin, and for every disadvantage, you can turn that into an advantage very easily. So one of the biggest advantages that's developing right now is, it doesn't necessarily have to be nefarious or anything, but parallel societies are kind of getting started. People are figuring out how to solve problems that may arise that don't really involve conflict, or are de-escalatory in nature, but they're solving problems. And that's a very good thing to see. It does bring a little bit of optimism and a lot of hope throughout these very, very bad disasters. So, we can focus on the negative, but I think it's better to acknowledge it and try to be more solution oriented, because the internet's a very strange place and there's a lot that can circulate for sure. So trying to be a little bit more solution oriented, find the problem, find ways to solve it that are creative. It's very, very important to move forward, I think.
Yes. Yeah. I am probably more optimistic than the evidence should lead me to be, but I also believe that is necessary.
Yeah.
I have a lot more reason to be optimistic than just the evidence that is before me. And there's a huge reason. This is a whole other conversation, but there's a huge reason to be building for the future when you have children. The generational separation that we see, young people saying that you can't trust boomers, old people saying that you can't understand. These are all good jokes and good memes. Like, I understand where this is coming from. And I also understand why there are deep generational divides and gaps. But there has to be a multi-generational problem-solving effort to solve multi-generational problems and to build multi-generational societies and civilizations. So this is something that we have to get better at. So I'm working on it.
No, you're definitely right. If we've got 100 years worth of problems, we're not going to solve them in 2 or 3 years, So it's definitely going to take multiple generations to kind of, get things back on track. We can start now, of course, but don't expect great, earth-shattering results tomorrow. Yeah. It's going to take some time, but that's also not an excuse to be lazy and be complacent about it.
Exactly.
We've got to be deliberate. So.
Yeah. my goal is to fix as many problems as possible while I can. So there's just less for my kids to do, less for my kids to deal with. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do that is out there, and I'm tremendously grateful that you came on the show to talk about these things, but also that you've been such a good example. You've created so much educational materials, and have done so much to build out, the amorphous, undefinable community, and just talking through these issues and providing the information. So keep up the good work, because it is tremendously appreciated.
Yeah, thank you. And likewise as well. I can't think of another company, sort of, entity that is doing the things that you guys are doing as well, to look at things from a very unique perspective, right? Of trying to do the best you
we'll
can
see if it's a good idea.
The world. Yeah. Hey, you got to just start somewhere. You got to try, right? So yeah, for sure. Really appreciate it, for sure.
Very good. Well, check out the S2 Underground resources, news reports, book reviews, and thank you for all the experimentation on radios and stuff. That is, again, it's a very important, extremely cool thing that is pretty unpleasant when you're actually troubleshooting.
Oh, yeah. I pulled my hair out too many times over radio than I can count, for sure. But yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Well, have a great rest of your day, everybody, and we'll find a nice ending somewhere in all this podcast has more endings than Lord of the Rings.
Exactly. No worries.
Keep thinking of more things to encourage people to do. That was a pretty long conversation, but we only just scratched the surface on what some of the needs might be. And they're going to be different based on the different areas that you are. What your threat model is, what needs you're going to run into will differ based on terrain and weather and season and all kinds of things like that. So in the comments down below, I would like you to ask some more questions about either specifics or how to go about getting those specifics, or let me know what things you are doing to be more prepared for the future.